I would tell my colleagues in the Senate, if you have ever visited a domestic violence survivors center and met with any of the victims, you'll never forget it. I swear you'll never forget it. I can remember the first time I met with one of the victims in one of the shelters. She was crying, her eyes were red, and one eye was blackened. And she choked back the tears and told me the story of what she'd lived through. For some reason, and I'm not a psychologist, I can't explain it, she blamed herself. And it happens so often. What happens to these women who are the victims of domestic violence and abuse? Where do they go? Some of them can't find anywhere to go and end up dying as a result of it. What happens to their kids who witness these acts of violence in the home when mom's getting strangled by this man? What happens to them? Well, luckily, we care enough in America to do something about it. Through VOCA, the Victims Fund, we send money to Harbor House and Lifespan and other agencies and say, do your best. Help them put their lives back together again. Protect them. Well, I want to fast forward and tell you 6 months after Sasha's experience, things are much better. She lives safely in an apartment that's provided by this agency. She still works with adult counselors and youth counselors to get herself and her kids through this. And she knows that she's not alone. These VOCA-funded advocates stepped into her life at just the right moment and saved her life. They may have saved the lives of her children too. So when we cut back on funding for whatever reason, we are jeopardizing the services that I just described that are so critical. With decreased VOCA funding, if we do nothing today, with decreased VOCA funding, Harbor House will have to cut 3 of its staffers, including a legal advocate, adult counselor, and youth counselor. Exactly the type of professionals that help Sasha and her family. The executive director said, if VOCA is cut, imagine being Sasha and having to go through this alone. That's why you've got to pass this bill. That's why it's so critical. As I noted last week, VOCA passed in 1984 to establish the Crime Victims Fund. We can't even count the number of people who've been helped over the years. 3,000 applicants come through my state attorney general's office in Illinois, and every state has a similar story to tell. Thousands of victims helped by service providers, victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, trafficking, and drunk driving. The Crime Victims Fund doesn't receive a dime of taxpayers' dollars. How about that? What I just described for you doesn't come out of the Treasury. It's funded through criminal fines, penalties, forfeited bail bonds, and special assessments collected by the federal government. Historically, most of the money comes from criminal fines, but in recent years, deposits have dropped off significantly. That's why we're here at this moment. They need help, and they need it now. Monetary penalties from deferred prosecutions and non-prosecution agreements are currently deposited in the Treasury instead of the fund, and as a result, the shift has had a devastating impact on the fund. That's why a bipartisan, bicameral group of members of Congress working with advocacy organizations have come up with this VOCA fix. Our bill would stabilize the depleted fund by redirecting monetary penalties from deferred prosecutions and non-prosecution agreements to the victims and services providers that need the help. The reduced deposits into the funds have already had a devastating impact. Victim assistance grants have been reduced by more than $600 million in this fiscal year, $600 million nationwide. And more cuts are coming if we don't do something today. Like Harbor House, advocates across the state and across the country are begging for help. We don't have any time to waste. Every day that goes by, we miss an opportunity to help replenish the fund and to put these services on the street. So far this year, the fund has already missed out on a total of nearly $550 million in deposits that could be helping these agencies. And we're not even halfway through the year. That's why it's imperative that we pass this bill. The House already did it in March, 3 months ago. Broad bipartisan support. Here in the Senate, we have a broad bipartisan coalition of 57 senators, 37 Democrats, and 21 Republicans. We all get it. We're all for crime victims. But we've been stopped because of an objection on the floor. Let's end this today. Whatever the merits of any budgetary argument, for goodness sakes, lives are at stake here. Unfortunately, this objection about moving forward was made last week and probably will be made again today. It involves Senator Toomey's concern about a budgetary issue. It's a complicated issue about something called chimps, for goodness sakes, which he can explain, and I'm sure he will. But after last week's argument on this, I went to the advocates who were telling us that we should send this money as quickly as we can and said, is he right? Is this designed without his amendment so that this money will not go to the people who need it? They said he's wrong. This is not going to happen. And here's their statement. During floor remarks for the unanimous consent last week, it was represented the VOCA Fix Act fails to correct certain structural issues that prevent the funds from reaching victims and their advocates. Underlined, the premise of this statement that these structural issues impact the distribution of VOCA funds to survivors and advocates is not accurate. This is from the actual agencies themselves. While the use of chimps as budget offsets continues to be a contentious issue, they said, the claim that appropriators hoard money rather than releasing it to victim service providers is false, inaccurate, and false. In reality, appropriators have substantially decreased the size of the budget offset by releasing far more than the amount required by this proposed substitute. And the proposed substitute intends to restructure the entire appropriations process is incredibly controversial. In other words, we're going to dive into the deep end of the pool on budget process and budget rules and budget regulation while people are literally drowning in violence, victims of domestic abuse. For goodness sakes, isn't there a better time and place and a better group to hold hostage? It shouldn't be these domestic violence victims. I yield at this point to Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you. Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
I won't speak long, but I wanted to echo the comments of our distinguished Judiciary Chairman because I've had a similar experience. As we were going through COVID, I was hearing from our domestic violence groups in Rhode Island that two things were happening at once. Instances were going up, people were trapped together, very difficult to find sanctuary houses to go to, and the experience of domestic violence was soaring. And while that was going on, the funding coming in to these agencies through VOCA was declining. Now, there's a pretty simple, well, first let me thank the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sojourner House, which provides sanctuary services, and Progreso Latino, which works in this space in our Latino community for their great work. There are a lot of organizations in this space, and I want to start by appreciating them. The problem has nothing to do with domestic violence or domestic violence victims as to the money. The problem is that more and more of these cases are resolved by deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements. But the funding for VOCA comes out of criminal sentences, criminal prosecutions. So because of that change in the way these cases are treated, which is actually a good thing generally, the money is diverted. And as a result, the Crime Victims Fund has reached its lowest level in 10 years. The victim assistance grants in Rhode Island fell 50%, 50%, cut in half from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 21, $7.6 million to $3.8 million, which means that many of these local organizations that put their heart and soul into protecting these victims at the worst time of their lives have to deal with 50% cuts. This is simple. It will allow monetary penalties in those deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements to flow the same way they flow when traditional prosecutions take place. This is endorsed across the board. This is as non-controversial as you get. 56 state and territorial attorneys general, more than 1,700 local, tribal, state, regional, and national advocacy, government, and law enforcement organizations. Just this year, $545 million has been lost to the VOCA fund because we haven't corrected this. So I would echo my chairman's remarks and urge my friend, the senator from Pennsylvania, to find another point of leverage, another fulcrum for his efforts to solve unrelated problems. But let this problem be solved and let these victims be served. I yield the floor.
I've got good news for my colleagues from Illinois and Rhode Island, and that is that the modification that I'm suggesting to the unanimous consent request proffered by the senator from Illinois is not complicated. It's got nothing to do with budget rules. In fact, it's the simplest thing in the world. Now, the senator from Illinois wants to put more money, and money from a new source, into the Crime Victims Fund. I completely agree. I fully support it. I've liked this idea from the first time I heard of it, and I've supported it. But there's something that's important to note here. The Crime Victims Fund is a federal government account, and the senator is very determined that more money go into that account. So what do we disagree on? Well, it's very simple. The senator from Illinois seems to be equally determined that there can be no requirement that the money actually come out of that account and go to crime victims and their advocates. That's the only thing that I want to do differently, is to insist that money going into that account actually comes out and goes to the victims of crimes and their advocates. Now, if my concern that this money is not going to end up going where it's advertised to go is not valid, then I don't know why my colleagues wouldn't agree to my very narrow amendment, which, by the way, doesn't have a thing to do with budget rules. I don't attempt to change budget rules in this effort. We should change them, but this isn't where I'm trying to do it. What I'm simply trying to do is make sure that the money that goes into the account, the increase too, actually goes to where it's supposed to go, which is the victims of crimes and their advocates. So you have to ask yourself, why would somebody oppose the proposal that this money actually be required to go to victims and their advocates? Why would somebody oppose that? Maybe it's because there's some other place that some of this money is meant to go. And that's at the heart of this. You see, under the ridiculous rules we operate under, if the money doesn't end up going to crime victims and their advocates, then it frees up additional money to be spent on whatever anybody else wants to spend it on. The money that is withheld from the people who are supposed to get it, crime victims and their advocates, creates the opportunity to spend more on who knows what. Now, would anyone actually do this, or is this just a theoretical construct that I've made up? Well, let's take a look at that recent history. The fact is, since 2000, in the year 2000, over $80 billion that could have and should have gone to crime victims and their advocates was intentionally withheld so that more money could be spent in other categories. What this chart shows is the amount of money year in and year out. It starts in 2000. You see these low bars, well under $1 billion was actually allocated to crime victims and their families. There was much more money going into those accounts, much more money. Because you see, how much going into the account isn't the only thing that matters. What's actually ultimately much more important is how much comes out of the account and goes to the crime. And only when I and some of my colleagues started raising hell about this, the dishonesty of it, the deception, the fact that crime victims and their advocates weren't getting nearly what they were supposed to be getting, only then, this is the red line represents when we started doing this, that's when the allocation started to change. This represents the huge surge in funds that we've been sending to crime victims and their advocates in recent years because some of us were no longer willing to tolerate this and we were raising Cain about what had been going on. Now, what I'm simply trying to do is prevent us from going back to what was routine around here, what was in standard operating procedures, which was to deceive people, pretend that money was going to end up going to Crime Victims Fund when everybody knew it wasn't. Now, why would I be concerned that we might be going back in that direction? Well, I'll tell you why. President Biden has been very instructive about this. In his budget that he released just months ago, he actually specifies that in his budget he wants money to be diverted from the Crime Victims Fund, which is mentioned by name, and one other fund, so that more money can be spent on other purposes. This is my concern. This isn't something that's been made up. This is President Biden in his budget asking us to go right back to what we used to do. And so then when I come down here and I suggest one modification to the very constructive idea that we add this settlement money to the fund, and the modification is that the money actually has to go to crime victims and their advocates, that's objected to. People are insistent that we not have a requirement that this money actually be allocated. So someone might think that that's pretty strong body of evidence that suggests maybe all of this money isn't going to end up where it's supposed to go. Therefore, I ask that the senator modify his request to include my amendment, which is at the desk, that it be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection to the
Mr. President,
modification?
reserving the right to object. If you listen to this explanation, there's one thing missing, and it's critical. There's a suggestion that this money for the crime victims funds is being spent for another purpose. You never heard that, did you? It said it could be, maybe it will be, it might be, but it hasn't been. Listen to what they say. These people in the advocacy groups who, believe me, are jealously watching every penny. They want every dollar, just as you do, and I do. And what do they say about your argument? The premise of your statement that these structural issues impact the distribution of victims' funds to survivors and advocates is not accurate. It goes on to say the claim that appropriators hoard the money rather than releasing it to victim services is false. It's from the very agencies receiving the money. Are they in on the deal, Senator? I don't think so. They're desperate for these funds, and without them, they're going to have a serious cutback in services. The proposed substitute, intended to restructure the entire appropriations process, is incredibly controversial, and you know it, and I know it as a member of the Appropriations Committee. And yet you're tangling up this entire appropriation for the victims of crime, victims of domestic abuse, women who are seeking shelter and help and hospital care and trying to care for their children and what they're going through. You want to hold back on the possibility somebody's going to spend this on something else, even though you have no proof that it's been done. None. And the people who are the advocates for these groups are saying to you, what you're saying is inaccurate and false, and you won't give it up. I'd suggest pick another target. Find some other group to make your budget point of order. Please don't take these people who are in the most desperate situations in their life. This is not the time and place to raise this budget debate. I sincerely hope that you'll think about them for a moment. I object to your modification.
Is there objection to the original request?
So reserving the right to object. This is an amazing argument the senator from Illinois is making. He's saying, don't worry, we would never do what the senator from Pennsylvania is suggesting might happen, and which, by the way, always used to happen, and which, by the way, the president is asking us to do. We would never do it. But I'll object to a requirement that the money actually go where we say it's going to go. I think that tells us all we need to know, and so I object.
Objection is heard.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.